Ocean of Storms by Brief and Dreamy. Chapter 1. Cold. So cold. Ice shifting wet and rough across his skin. Gasping, Harry rolled over and fumbled at the bedside table until he found his glasses. He could still see the tail of the dream as it fled around the corner of his memory. The forest, a pool of inky tar, being unable to move. He rubbed at his face and found it damp and clammy. Shivering, muscles stiff, he sat up and pulled the blankets around his shoulders. I'm still here. The words didn't fit with the dream, but they nevertheless sat heavy in his mind. Can you help? Harry, can you help? The voice had sounded real. He parted his bed curtains and peered through the heavy darkness. All the other boys were fast asleep, or at least not moving or speaking. He alone was awake. The voice must have come from his dream. He slid out of bed. The cold of the bare stone floor bit at the soles of his feet as he stumbled to the bathroom. Harry hated living underground. He didn't know how the Slytherins stood it year after year. He felt buried, water through the windows above, solid earth surrounding them everywhere else. The dungeons made Harry's bones ache with cold, even when the hearth in the common room blazed with fire. He drank straight from the snake-shaped tap. The water cleared his head. If he'd been in Gryffindor Tower, if the tower hadn't been deemed uninhabitable, he could have glanced out a window to tell the time. Instead, he returned to the dorm and retrieved his watch, then cast a mild Lumos to read it. 5:37. No point in going back to bed. By the time he fell asleep, he'd have to get up again. Harry shrugged into his flannel dressing gown, grabbed his book, and headed for the common room. With a suppressed groan, he paused in the doorway. Malfoy's hair gleamed golden in the firelight. He was in Harry's favorite spot, the ancient wing chair with upholstery worn soft as silk. Malfoy held an enormous leather-bound book in his lap. If there had been other people in the room, Harry could have ignored him and just curled up on the sofa. If you entered a room inhabited by only one other person, however, you just had to greet them or you'd look like a git. Just as Harry decided to go back to bed, Malfoy spotted him. He stared, expressionless, then sighed, a line forming between his eyebrows. He nodded at Harry. Harry nodded in return. Malfoy turned back to his book. Harry threw himself down on the green leather sofa, which was too far away from the fire to catch enough of its warmth. He should have known Malfoy might be in the common room. He was always up and gone before any of the other boys were awake. There'd been a few awkward mornings when they'd first arrived. Harry had been taken aback by the bizarre sight of Malfoy in pajamas, hair mussed, face flushed from sleep, Malfoy brushing his teeth, Malfoy showering. Malfoy had ignored the rest of them, a constant sneer on his face, refusing to make eye contact. Then Ron made a comment about his monogrammed slippers, and they didn't see Malfoy in the mornings anymore. Harry tightened the belt of his dressing gown and opened his book, Crypts and Curses by Venture Craggy. He'd swiped it from the bookshelf in the Burrows sitting room. It had probably belonged to Bill. He tried to lose himself in descriptions of dark magic and ways to counter it, but couldn't focus. Malfoy's presence was too distracting. He shot him a glance. The wing chair was angled, so Harry could only see his fingers digging into the armrest and the side of his face-sharp cheekbones brightening and darkening in the firelight. Harry still didn't know why Malfoy was here. Why he'd returned to Hogwarts when all the other male Slytherins in his year had stayed well away. A brass candelabra, shaped like bloody snakes again, stood on the table next to the sofa. Harry lit the candles to give himself more light than the overhanging lamps provided. Something gray flashed by the windows, weaving through the green water. Too small to be a squid, a merperson maybe, or moaning myrtle. A sleek black cat leapt onto the sofa and blinked at Harry with yellow eyes. He wondered who it belonged to. He blinked back at it, and it curled up, half on top of his feet. It mewed at him, and Harry mewed back, because it only seemed polite. Malfoy muttered something under his breath. After a few more tries, Harry immersed himself in his book, The Anti-Dermis Curse. The victim's skin vanished completely, countered with a stasis charm, followed by a course of numbing and skin repair potions that took several weeks to work. Formicae Ferris transfigured the victim into a swarm of ants. Countered with a reversal spell so complicated, Harry decided to discuss it with Hermione later. Expurvit Catna formed a chain between... A sharp clap made Harry jump. Malfoy had snapped his book shut. With an irritated expression, he stood and slid it back into the bookshelf, then turned and marched towards the exit. Harry watched him over the top of his book, trying not to be obvious about it. The cat stretched, leapt off the sofa, and crept away into the darkness. Malfoy shot him a look as he passed. "Nice pajamas, Potter." Harry rolled his eyes and gave him 2 fingers. Malfoy slammed the door behind him. Given the door was solid stone, he must have used a spell to do it. Harry smiled. The war hadn't made Malfoy any less dramatic. And, he realized, that had been the longest conversation, if you could call it a conversation, that they'd had since arriving back at Hogwarts. Not that Harry was complaining. Living in the Slytherin dungeons was bad enough without having to socialize with Draco Malfoy on top of it. Merlin. Harry hated it down here. His skin would begin to crawl as soon as he crossed the threshold. The murky green light, the snakes. It reminded him of Grimmauld Place and made his stomach ache. The brief interaction with Malfoy had left him feeling oddly better, though. Perhaps it was the normality of it. The flutter in his pulse as he automatically prepared to square off. Everything was so different now. The castle broken and gaping, no lessons, no exams to worry about, no Snape. So many people no longer there. Harry rubbed his eyes. When he opened them again, the early morning gloom had shifted. Sunlight filtered down through the water, making the portholes glow with rippling patterns. Harry set down his book and ran his fingers through his hair. Hogwarts had changed so much that an exchange of hostilities with Malfoy was now a bit of nostalgic fun. "There you are!" Ron poked his head through the archway leading to the dorms. He yawned, hair askew. "Nightmare?" "Nah," Harry lied, getting up. "Just woke up early for some reason. It's so bloody cold down here." "Is it?" Harry looked at Ron's t-shirt and boxers, his bare freckled legs. "You're not cold?" "Nah, just normal. Hope you're not getting ill, mate." Harry shook his head. "Come on, let's get dressed and get breakfast." "Not gonna argue with that." Back in the dorm, Harry pulled on his clothes. Jeans and the Harpies t-shirt Ginny had given him, too thin for underground but suitable for the early June heat outside. With Malfoy gone, he could almost imagine he was back in Gryffindor Tower. Neville gave Harry a sleepy smile as he wandered towards the bathroom. His blonde hair had grown long and hung sleek on either side of his round face. Dean and Seamus play-fought, Seamus laughing hysterically, Dean covered in a gooey mess that looked like the result of a WWW prank. Harry took a deep breath. They were moving forward, all of them, everyone who'd returned to help put Hogwarts back together. But some things remained familiar, and Harry needed that after so much irrevocable change, even if it came in the form of Draco Malfoy. Auror Meyer swept his wand along the grass, leaving an expanding stripe of glowing light in its wake. "Singo domicilium?" Harry asked, then ran the back of his hand across his forehead and wiped the sweat off of his jeans. "Singo domicilium," Auror Meyer repeated. Harry mimicked the incantation and arm movement and watched as the band of glowing gold continued to expand. It curved around the lake, which glistened in the sunshine, and skirted the edge of the forbidden forest. It swept inward, beneath their feet, coating the ground. Harry followed it with his eyes as it moved towards the castle. A pair of kids in the distance spotted it approaching, shrieked, and ran away. Harry grinned. After a moment, the spell faded and became invisible. "That was very good, Harry. Your wrist is stiff. You should turn it more," Meyer continued. He shook his light brown fringe out of his face and smiled. Harry reckoned he was in his late 20s. Square-jawed, kind blue eyes. Impressive looking in his dark red uniform in a way that made Harry a bit bashful. Someday he'd wear a uniform like that. He hoped he'd fill it out as well as Meyer. "Let's try again, but this time focus on your attachment to Hogwarts." "My attachment?" Harry looked up at the castle. "The spell works best when cast by someone with an emotional connection to the protected property." The castle stretched upwards at the top of the hill, gray spires cutting into the clear blue expanse of the sky. Mountains rising up around it in the distance. Harry's heart twisted. A good chunk of Gryffindor Tower was missing. Ravenclaw Tower rose intact, but blackened by fire. Piles of crumbled stone and wood littered the outskirts, the remains of walls and bridges. His first real home, so damaged. Wounded, really. But he reminded himself, repairable. And theirs. He cast the spell again, letting the ache inside power it. The golden light flowing from his wand burned brighter than before. Meyer gave him a pat on the back. Harry smiled at him. Someone coughed. Harry turned and saw Ginny wearing grass-stained Quidditch gear, her broom over her shoulder, one of her eyebrows arched. "What?" Harry asked. "Lunch in a minute. You coming?" "See you tomorrow, Harry," said Meyer. He moved off towards the forest, tall and straight-backed. Harry watched him for a moment, his confidence, the strength of his stride. When he looked back at Ginny, she was biting her lip, eyes sparkling with amusement. "What?" he asked again. They started climbing the hill. "Why are you looking at me like that?" "Like what?" Ginny gave him her innocent eyes. "Like you think I've done something funny and don't know it? You're imagining things." She swatted him on the bum with her broom. Harry jumped and laughed. He tried to grab it from her, but she swung it behind her back and kept moving in a circle, facing him until he gave up. "How's the Quidditch pitch looking?" "Better. We've regrown most of the grass." They walked in silence for a moment. Ginny looked happy, but there were shadows beneath her eyes. She saw him looking. "You go first." Harry frowned. "I went first last time. I want to hear yours before I tell you mine." Neville and Hannah approached from the direction of the greenhouses. Hannah had her arm around Dennis Creevy's shoulders and was talking to him as he sobbed. Harry stopped walking. Ginny took his hand. "Not your fault, Harry," she said. "Not your fault." He kicked at a clump of grass. "So it was bad? Your nightmare?" Looking towards the castle, Ginny nodded. "Right, I'll go then." He let go of Ginny's hand and fixed his fingers. "I don't remember it all that clearly. I was in the forest." "Merlin," said Ginny, using the funny voice she saved for their game, or ritual, whatever this thing was that they did for each other. "When are you not in the forest? Tell your subconscious to get some original material." "There was this black pool." "That means you need to take a bath." Harry snorted. "I was outside the pool, looking down, and then I was in it, up to my knees." The dream came back to him, creeping over his skin like smoke. His throat tightened, making it harder to talk. "He was waiting for me, calling for me, but I was stuck in the pool. I knew that if I didn't pull myself free and get to him in time, he'd start killing people." Ginny listened with one of her blazing looks. "But I couldn't. It was like the water or tar or whatever, it wouldn't let me go. When I tried to lift my leg, it would yank me back down again. And then he started listing names, telling me who he was going to kill first. Ron, Hermione, you." He was laughing at me for not being able to stop him. "You don't make it easy," she said, but then her expression became determined. "Not laughing anymore, is he? Voldy McWorm food, Lord Moldy Pants." The memory of the dream still floated dark in his mind, but his mouth twitched. "You reckon he ever snorted when he laughed?" Ginny continued. "Could he snort? Without a nose, I mean?" Harry grinned. "And he was shit at comedy himself, wasn't he? Couldn't tell a proper joke to save his life. You expect more from a bloke with the last name Riddle." Cracking up, Harry grabbed her and kissed the top of her head. "You're brilliant," he said, and thought, "I love you," but didn't say it. He pulled back and brushed some hair off of her face. "Your turn now. Can we skip me today?" "Nope. If you're trying to get out of your go, you need it even more than I did." "Yeah." She screwed her face up. "All right." She covered her eyes with her hand. "Damn it." "It's okay," Harry said. "Go on." "Who's Fred?" Harry had guessed so. Dreams about Fred were harder on Ginny than anything else. "I was in my room at home," she said, "trying to write an owl. I don't even remember who it was for. But the letters kept tangling up, and none of the words came out the way I wanted them to, and I got really angry at my quill and started yelling at it. Sometimes you just need to tell a quill what's what. You can't let them push you around. Awful bullies, quills." She smiled, but Harry could tell she was forcing it. "And I heard him, Fred, behind me, sitting on my bed. He said, 'Why are you wasting your time with that nonsense when you could be outside flying?' He had a point." I said, 'I thought you died.' And in the dream, I thought, no, I was wrong. He's here. He didn't die after all. And I was happy, so relieved." She held herself together, but tears slid slowly down her cheeks. Harry thought as hard as he could for something funny to say, but came up blank. Then I turned around to look at him, said Ginny, and there was no one there. The thing is, said Harry, terrified he was making a mistake, you can always remember he's the one who died. Fred rhymes with dead. Ginny's mouth fell open. Harry cringed, wondering if it was possible to obliterate her. "Oh my God," said Ginny, "you're horrible. That's awful." She punched him on the arm and then burst out laughing. Her cheeks were still wet. "That's the worst thing anyone has ever said. I can't believe it." Harry rubbed at the back of his neck. "We're done." She wiped her eyes on her shirt sleeve. "Let's go." As they made their way to the top of the hill, she hooked their pinky fingers together. Harry had that weird spacey feeling he got sometimes after laughing hard or crying. The dream was gone, though, its power destroyed. When they reached the castle, he took her by the shoulders and pressed their foreheads together. She grasped his wrists and squeezed. They stayed like that for a moment. Harry breathed in her flowery scent, which filled him with as much regret as happiness these days. Ginny pulled away. "See you later, Harry," she said, then ran over to Dean, who was eyeing Harry warily. Folding his arms, Harry watched them walk into the castle holding hands. He'd waited too long. He'd only had enough energy for Ron and Hermione in the days after the war. He'd held Ginny in his mind, something bright and lovely for when he was ready for real life again, for the part of his life that didn't have to do with Voldemort or the war. And there were the funerals and the trials, and they left him too drained to reach out to her. By the time he was ready to move forward, Ginny had made up with Dean, and they were together. He looked around, waiting for Ron to get back from the far side of the lake where he'd been working with his Auror, a middle-aged woman named Jimenez. He couldn't spot him, and he didn't see Hermione either. Sighing, Harry went into the castle on his own. Ginny and Dean, Ron and Hermione, Lavender and Parvati, Malcolm Baddock and a boy in Hufflepuff, according to gossip. People seemed to be pairing off as if they'd just survived a war. Not Harry, though, which was all right. He was fine with that. That could come later, once Hogwarts was repaired, once he was training to be an Auror. Go flying later, he decided. Burn off all this restless energy. Professor McGonagall descended the grand staircase, followed by a sour-looking Malfoy, who gave Harry a cold glance as he passed. Chin high, hair slicked back, his robes flowed gracefully as he walked, composed and tidy. It didn't fool Harry. He'd seen Malfoy during the trials, when his hair had hung tangled in his face and his robes had been wrinkled and unwashed. He'd looked so fragile, bound into the iron chair in the ministry courtroom, shaking and desperate, young. Harry had felt enormous relief when Malfoy was cleared of all charges on the basis of his youth and Harry's testimony. Despite everything, Harry didn't want to see him go to Azkaban. Malfoy had been caught up in forces beyond his control every bit as much as he had. The professional builders, visiting Aurors, and spell experts took up the two tables on the left side of the Great Hall. Harry searched them until he spotted Meyer, then approached the group of 50 or so students sitting at the two tables on the right. Apart from the Slytherins, who kept to the end of one table, house divisions had fallen away and they sat mixed together. Harry was surprised to see Theonaught with his ratty face sitting across from Malfoy. He must have just arrived. Naught's father was in Azkaban. Harry resolved to keep an eye on him. He wondered where Naught would sleep, as their dorm room was already full. The only other Slytherins from Harry's year were Daphne Greengrass and Millicent Bulstrode. They were surrounded by younger students. Short little Malcolm Baddock, a girl who looked very much like Daphne. Harry didn't know the names of the others. He slipped in beside Neville, who was trying to spell the soil out from beneath his fingernails. "Do you have to do that at the table?" asked Lavender, wrinkling her nose. "Really?" echoed Parvati. Sorry. Neville put his wand away. Sat down at the table, puffy-eyed and quiet. Harry caught his eye and smiled. Dennis smiled back, and there was something genuinely bright in it which made Harry's eyes sting. Sometimes Harry caught Dennis staring at him with an odd expression. A lot of the younger kids did that. A lot of the adult builders did, too. None of them had tried to catch him and give him one of those "so grateful for all that you've done" speeches that made Harry want to spontaneously combust, think Merlin. Thought Professor McGonagall might have had a word with them. Finally, Ron and Hermione arrived and sat down opposite Harry. Hermione's hair looked suspiciously messy. Ron's ears shone red. Harry stopped looking at them and played with his fork. "Sorry, mate," said Ron. I had to run back to the dorm for your handkerchief," finished Hermione. "That what they're calling it these days?" asked Seamus. "Handkerchief?" "You've got twigs in your hair, Hermione," said Luna. "You've been lying on the grass. It's a beautiful day for it. The clouds are making all sorts of shapes." Hermione blushed. "I was helping Professor Slughorn gather herbs in the forest. The potion supplies are dangerously low. Ron was kind enough to help us carry the baskets." "I saw Slughorn carrying the baskets toward the supply room," said Seamus. "So must have been something else that made you late for lunch." "Stop being childish, Seamus," said Hermione. "Yeah," said Ron. He leaned back to pluck the twig from Hermione's hair and gave Seamus a wink. "Grow up." Harry was relieved when the dishes filled up with sandwiches and they all started to eat. He felt a bit peeved that Ron and Hermione hadn't come to find him before lunch, but, well, things had changed. He was still getting used to it. The owls arrived and dropped the prophet on the table in front of Hermione. She spread it open, and Harry tried to read the upside-down headlines across the table. "Anything about Dolohov?" he asked. "Nothing," said Ron, his face darkening. Harry shook his head. Why haven't they found him yet? He pushed his plate away. "Robard should let me help with the search. I could be useful. I've been out there. I've fought them." Dolohov had slipped away in the aftermath of the battle. So far, no one had found any trace of him. Dolohov had killed Remus Lupin. Harry wouldn't be happy until he was back in Azkaban. If he could put him there himself, so much the better. He'd be able to tell Teddy that he'd done it, that he'd found justice for his father's killer. He'd fought and subdued Dolohov before. He reckoned he could do it again. "You're doing important work here, Harry," said Hermione. "You're making Hogwarts safe again." Out of the corner of his eye, Harry noticed Malfoy listening in. "Wait," said Ron, sitting up straight and pointing to an article at the bottom of the page. "It says here that Dolohov was spotted in Glasgow." "Dolohov?" said Malfoy. Something about his tone of voice made Harry look at him. "What do you know about it?" Conversation at the table trailed off. "I know Dolohov," said Malfoy. "I know that if he's as close as Glasgow, you lot," he gestured towards Harry and his friends, "better get a move on with making Hogwarts safe again." Harry stared Malfoy down. Be specific. It was like interrogating a subject. Harry was the Auror, Malfoy the Death Eater. He wondered if Meyer would be impressed if he could see him. "Specific?" Malfoy's eyelashes fluttered, but he didn't look away. "I once saw him incinerate a family of 4 muggles with one spell. He does it slowly, starting at the feet and creeping upwards." Lavender gasped and started crying, squeaky, strangled little sobs. Parvati wrapped her arm around her and stroked her. Harry swallowed. "And what were you doing when this happened?" Malfoy didn't answer for a moment. He'd gone still. "You know what I was doing," he finally said, voice tight. Harry didn't know what he meant. He looked at Ron. Ron shrugged. "You know," said Malfoy louder. "Well then," said McGonagall, who had appeared at the head of the table. Her eyes moved between Harry and Malfoy. "Time to get back to work." "The castle won't heal itself," said Dean. "It will, given enough time," said Hermione. "I've read up on it. But it'll go a lot faster if we hurry it along." Harry looked at Malfoy again, but Malfoy had turned away and was talking to Nott. Malfoy didn't know about the connection Harry'd had with Voldemort, so he couldn't be referring to that. Why did he think Harry knew what he'd been doing? "Please come with me, Potter," said Professor McGonagall. Harry looked up, trying to figure out what he'd done wrong in the past few hours. "Nothing to be concerned about. I have something to show you, and I think you'll be pleased." She turned to Malfoy. "We'll stop by my office, Malfoy, and then get back to work on the mirrors." While everyone else went off to their afternoon tasks, Harry and Malfoy followed Professor McGonagall up the grand staircase towards her office. Malfoy trudged along as if he'd resented each and every stair, leaving several yards' distance between himself and Harry. Malfoy spotted Harry looking at him, glared, and looked away. Despite this, Harry slowed his pace until he and Malfoy were side by side. "What did you mean by that?" he asked. Malfoy's lip curled, but he didn't answer. Would I have known what you were doing with Dollhov? Harry persisted. Watch your step, Potter, said Malfoy. His hand twitched in his pocket. His lips moved silently. Harry tripped over his own feet and crashed to the floor, just managing to break his fall with his hands. He took a few seconds to let the shock fade. He'd banged his knee rather hard. He pushed himself up and saw McGonagall rushing towards him. You're a prick, he muttered under his breath. Malfoy smirked. What on earth? McGonagall helped Harry stand. Are you quite all right, Potter? Yeah, said Harry. Don't know what happened. He set off again. His knee ached, but he kept his gait steady, refusing to let Malfoy see him limp. McGonagall gave the password, Fortitude, to the stone gargoyle, who seemed rather pleased to have regained his perch after the battle, and the three proceeded up the spiral staircase. Malfoy seemed to be in a better mood now. He wore a smile that made Harry buzz with the urge to hex him back. But Professor McGonagall was right there watching them. Merlin. They'd lived through a war. Barely lived through a war, and they were still jabbing at each other like first years. He let his irritation fade. The best policy would be to just ignore Malfoy as much as possible. Afternoon sunlight flooded through the windows of McGonagall's office, painting the walls and furniture buttery yellow. The room smelled of tea and parchment. The tables were still laden with magical artifacts and devices, some familiar, some he didn't remember seeing before. A brass globe engraved with runes, something that looked like an old-fashioned radio, and there was a pensieve. On reflex, Harry glanced at Dumbledore's portrait, but he was fast asleep. Malfoy made a quiet, startled sound. Harry followed his gaze and had to grab onto the back of the chair to steady himself. It's here, he said. Yes, said Professor McGonagall. I thought you'd like to see it. Like wasn't the right word. Snape sneered down at Harry, standing straight, looking just as greasy and antagonistic as he had while alive. Harry went hot with instinctual anger. A wave of sorrow crashed over him. He tried to speak, but found his throat had closed up. Pull yourself together, Potter. I'm here at your personal request, or so I've been told. Try not to embarrass yourself, if that is at all possible. Snape's slow, cold voice was as irritating as ever. Malfoy laughed. He looked delighted. Potter fell flat on his face on the way up, he said, bright and eager. Our savior, but he can't put one foot properly in front of the other. Harry felt a soft pressure on his shoulder. McGonagall's hand. We'll need some time to get accustomed to it, she said. Yeah, said Harry. He didn't know what he'd expected. He'd only thought about the fact that the portrait belonged there, not what it would be like to stand there and look at Snape and be able to speak with him. Mr. Malfoy, said Snape, you survived, I see, despite your willful disregard of all my advice. Pleasure dropped from Malfoy's face. He looked at Harry, then quickly away again. We should get on with our work now, boys, said McGonagall. There'll be time to converse with Professor Snape, should you wish, on another day. She urged Harry towards the door. Malfoy ignored her. You were on Dumbledore's side the entire time, he said, his voice brittle. The entire time, and you never once. You didn't even try. Foy, said McGonagall, please. Everything you ever said to me was a lie, said Malfoy. Then he spun and marched out of the office. His footsteps rang as he ran down the stone stairs. McGonagall sighed. I'm afraid there are rather a lot of people who will want to have words with you, Severus, she said. I foresee taking a large number of naps, if that's the case. Snape swirled his cape, then sat down heavily in the carved wooden chair behind him. Let's go, Harry, said McGonagall. Harry blinked at her use of his first name, then swallowed down the pressure between his ribs. She squeezed his shoulder, then moved her hand to his back. With gentle pressure, she ushered him out of her office. Harry ran into Hermione, but not Ron, on his way down the stairs. He's taking some time to himself, she said. Flitwick took us up on the corridor where Fred died. Ron hadn't been expecting it. Is he okay? Stupid question. Of course Ron wasn't okay. Merlin, there was an emotional booby trap around every corner. Seeing the portrait had left Harry feeling raw and unbalanced, and now he felt heavy with guilt. He considered taking some time to himself as well. He'll be okay in a bit. Are you all right, Harry? There was no chance of keeping his feelings to himself with Hermione present. Snape's portrait arrived. He examined a loose thread at the bottom of his t-shirt. Oh, what was it like? Was he wearing his usual robes? Holding anything in his hands? Sitting or standing? Did he say anything to you? Harry shrugged. Oh, it must have felt very strange. Yeah, it did. I'm helping Madam Pince in the library, she said, giving him a thoughtful look, reshelving books, putting the ones that need repairing to the side. Want to come along? Sure, he said, and smiled at her. Steady, tedious, mindless work. It sounded perfect. Honestly, Harry, she said as they set off, you need to allow yourself space to experience all the complicated emotions being back in the castle will inevitably provoke. If you try to bottle things up, you'll be worse off in the long run. And there's nothing wrong with having a good long cry. I want you to know that. I'll keep it in mind, he said. A good long cry. I'll schedule it in for Thursday after lunch. She rolled her eyes, then rubbed his shoulder again. Grinning, Harry let her. Harry pulled on his pajama bottoms and reached under his pillow for the t-shirt he slept in. I'm still here, said a voice. He froze. The same voice from that morning. He was definitely not dreaming now. Harry, the voice whispered. Someone young, a boy. And Harry recognized it. He'd heard the voice before, but neither a name nor a face to match it came to mind. He'll be angry if he knows I'm talking to you, but we're stuck. Harry, can you help? Night, Harry, said Ron. He yawned, not at all looking as if he'd just heard a strange, whispering voice. Neville rummaged through his trunk. Dean was already in bed, and Seamus was in the bathroom. Harry had no idea where Malfoy was. Ron lay down and closed his bed curtains. Harry remained standing, listening. The voice didn't say anything else. He shook his head, then checked the bedside table for the Weasleys' curse-breaking book, but it wasn't there. Merlin, he hoped he hadn't lost it. He thought back to the last time he'd had it and realized that he must have left it on the sofa that morning. With a sigh, he got up to retrieve it, not bothering with his dressing gown, as he'd only be a few seconds. He regretted his lack of clothes immediately upon entering the common room. The icy night air bit at his bare skin. The fire had been lit, but a group of Slytherins sat around it, hogging all the warmth. Some of them turned and looked as he crossed the room towards the sofa. Malfoy stared, his lips pursed. Harry should have at least pulled on his t-shirt. He hunched over, hugging himself, and grabbed the book from the side table. What was the state of the Gryffindor common room? Malfoy's mocking drawl sent a shiver down Harry's spine. The lot of you wandering around half naked? Salazar. He turned to the rest of the group. Can you imagine? It's enough to make you want to risk self-obliviation. Nervous laughter from the other Slytherins. Well, some of them. Malcolm frowned and looked at his knees, not rolled his eyes. Harry began walking back to the dorm room. Just getting my book, Malfoy. It's a lack of breeding, Malfoy continued. It's the best one can expect from a half-blood raised by muggles. Harry grit his teeth and tried not to let his temper rise. Do shut up, Draco, said a female voice. You're only embarrassing yourself. I'll speak when I want to, Malfoy snapped. Having a go at Harry Potter makes you look like an absolute arse. You realize that, don't you? Harry turned to look at the girl. It was the blonde who looked like Daphne Greengrass. Astoria, that was her name. The black cat he'd seen earlier was curled up in her lap, and she massaged the back of its neck, making it purr. He thought he might like her. She's right, Draco, said Nott. Keep that up and you'll embarrass us all. There's nothing to be gained from it. They don't belong here, said Malfoy. It makes everything awkward and the dungeon hates them, especially the half-bloods and the if you use that word, I swear to Merlin I'll slap you, said Astoria. Harry crept closer to get a look at her face. Sharp features, small and bird-like, with fierce, intelligent eyes. He definitely liked her. I was going to say Muggle-born, said Malfoy. I'm not an idiot, and you can't argue that this situation, he gestured towards Harry, isn't awkward for everyone. Not enjoying it any more than you, said Harry, but it's how things are, and we need to just get on and make the problem is, you don't know how to behave, said Malfoy, giving Harry an icy stare, half naked in public. Irritation to cold. Why couldn't they just ignore each other? And the common room didn't count as public? Piss off. And Half-Blood? You're still on that track? Malfoy's face colored, but he said, "You're still a Half-Blood." The sinking feeling of disappointment surprised Harry. He tightened his fingers around his wand. "I am, and you're still a bigot." "It's a fact." Malfoy's brow creased. "You're a Half-Blood." "I thought maybe you'd have changed," said Harry, "that you'd have learned something." Staring at Harry's hand, Malfoy said, "Put your wand away, Potter. You can't duel in here." "But I was raised by muggles. I'm too dim to know about things like that." "This is what I was trying to say." He turned to the others, smirking. Harry thought it might be a good time to get back at Malfoy for the tripping jinx. He pointed his wand at him. Malfoy swiveled to face Harry again. "I meant it, Potter. Don't—" He wasn't going to take orders from this git. He shot a mild stinging hex at him. Malfoy cursed and ducked, pulling down some of the other Slytherins as well. The hex flashed over Malfoy's head, hit the wall, and ricocheted right back towards Harry. Harry yelped and jumped out of the way. It hit the wall behind him, shot towards the ceiling, then bounced off the floor. The Slytherin shrieked. A number cast shield charms. Harry dodged the jinx again, then crouched with his hands over his head as it continued to snap around the room like a pinball. After several long seconds, the spell lost steam and vanished. Harry stayed on the floor, cringing in anticipation of whatever Malfoy was going to say next. "Very good," said Malfoy. "Throw your wand around like an erumpment in a china shop. You're an idiot, Potter." Harry shot up, hands in fists. "I didn't know, did I? I bloody told you not to do it. You say a lot of things and most of it's bollocks." "Ugh!" Astoria leapt to her feet. She couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall. "It is late and I am tired, and you will both settle down this moment or I will curse you to smithereens." Harry shoved his wand in his pajama pocket. "Sorry," he said to Astoria. She glared at him. "Think about the example you're setting for the younger children." Malfoy threw himself into his chair and crossed his arms. It took a moment for Harry to stop staring at him. Merlin Malfoy made him itch. He'd forgotten just how much. He just wanted to, bloody toffee-nosed, pointy-faced arsehole. Harry wanted to spell his mouth shut. He wanted to throw him against a wall and punch his face in. Throbbing with anger, he returned to the dorm and got into bed. The idea that he'd ever seen Malfoy's presence as pleasantly familiar seemed ridiculous now. Harry hated him, and he always would. He tried to read, tried to fall asleep. He sat up and punched his pillow until his fist ached. He'd meant to go flying, he remembered, but had forgotten. Maybe he'd go now, but that meant walking back through the common room. He grabbed his pillow and smashed it against his face. Someone laughed. Harry dropped the pillow. It was his phantom voice, the boy. "Don't be angry, Harry. I wasn't spying, I promise." "Who are you?" Harry lit his wand and searched the corners of his bed curtains. "Where are you?" "I'll tell you," said the voice, "but you have to promise to keep it a secret. He doesn't want anyone to know about us yet." "Who doesn't? Know about what?" Harry peeked into the dorm room and saw something shimmery disappear around the corner of his bedpost. No one else seemed to be reacting to the voice. He snatched his glasses and put them on, then settled back onto the bed. "Close your eyes." That didn't seem like a good idea. "No, just tell me who you are." "Harry, please, I'm scared." Harry bit his lip, then closed his eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he felt something cold against his knee, like he was being tapped with an ice cube. A waft of frigid air blew against his face. Startled, his eyelids fluttered open. Silvery gray eyes and a silvery gray face stared back at him. Harry gasped and pulled away. "Colin!" "Hi, Harry," the boy said, dejected. "I'm sorry about the haunting. I just wasn't sure what else to do."